Pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk more about the political constraints on the president we're facing. I have to say this is a conversation that I've had with a lot of people in this room, and I'm proud to say more often in the student role than in the teacher role. Ron Haskins took on the unenviable task of starting to teach me about poverty and welfare way back in the late 1980s when I was in the Congress, and I continue to pick up the phone and ask him every time I need to know something about it. And I'm reminded, as a sign of both of our ages, that Bill Galston and I actually started collaborating at an Aspen Institute project called the Domestic Strategy Group on these issues some almost 15 years ago now. And every time, and we serve on the board together now, and every time he says something, I perk up. So I'm glad to be with two people that have taught me a great deal about this. I think the question of sort of whether or not the political will exists to change in a positive direction on poverty is an interesting one, and it sort of goes to the question of whether or not this hostile environment that Republicans face is simply an anti-Bush backlash, or if it's really the start of a new progressive era of some definition in American politics. There's a lot of evidence that it could be the latter. Public attitudes towards government activity seem to have changed quite a bit over the years. Public concern about all the issues that have been raised here seems to be rising. The evangelical community has a much reported change of priorities, or at least addition of priorities that certainly includes poverty, both in this world and beyond, which affects the Republican Party's attitude towards these issues. And so there is some reason to believe that there is a new political environment in which we can actually hope to make some progress. I think it has to be done on a bipartisan basis, or it won't happen regardless of what happens in the next election. And I'd like to talk about that just a little bit in terms of the constraints the next president is going to face regardless of who he or she might be. Kind of interesting, the campaign, particularly on the Democrat side, but on both sides a little bit, has repeated this phrase in recent weeks: who will be ready on day one? And it sort of raises the question, well, what will the president hear on day one? I am sorry to inform everybody in this room that the first briefing the president receives will not be on poverty in America. The first briefing the president receives is going to be on the national security situation in the world, and more bad news, the world that the next president faces, to his or her dismay, is unfortunately going to be the same world that George Bush looks at every day. And they may look at it differently, but it's going to be the same world. And that's really reflected pretty much in the kinds of proposals you see coming out of the two campaigns, where there is a great deal of rhetoric about the disagreements of the two parties on what has happened in the past, but not a huge disagreement about the commitment of resources going forward. Both parties are pretty much committed to expanding resources on national security, resources on homeland security, resources to fight the threats that we see. Second of all, that president is likely to be told that he is in the midst of, at best, a shaky economy, an economy that is either in recession, sliding into recession, or maybe sliding out of recession, but certainly a shaky economy that will balloon the short-term deficit and make the immediate problem of deficit reduction even more severe. Third, the president knows, because they've all talked about this somewhat, that he or she faces, in addition to the short-term problem because of the recession, an enormous, almost insurmountable long-term problem in terms of deficits because of primarily entitlement commitments, largely health care going forward. And we have now both parties who have committed themselves to combating this problem in serious ways. The Democrats took advantage of the fiscal problems of this administration successfully in the 2006 elections. That's good news for them. The bad news for them is they are now committed to their own pay-go proposals, which means they are going to come into office committed to dealing with the fiscal situation in a way that's going to force them to make difficult decisions. And the Republicans, after a period of profligacy, have been told repeatedly that they've lost their brand, and they are now committed to coming back into office, either as the majority or the minority, committed to being tougher and harsher and more committed to reducing spending than ever before, so that they can once again be the party of fiscal responsibility. Those are kind of the restraints that the next president is going to face. If a Republican is president, his priorities are going to be national security, extending the tax cuts, and cutting spending. Which may maybe lead you to say, well, we're certainly better off then with a Democrat in the White House. Some ways I think that that's true, even though I'm a Republican. But if you look at the priorities of the Democrats, I'm sorry to say, reducing poverty is not at the top of their priority list either. Ending the war in Iraq is at the top of their priority list. Raising taxes is high on their priority list. But when you get to spending, it's really health care and maybe climate change that are higher on their priority list. You get down a ways before you get to the issues that we're talking about here today. And again, if you were talking about them in the context of surplus budgets and no overseas challenges, you could probably get there pretty easily. The challenge is going to be getting to that level of, on the priority list in the face of these major constraints on whoever the next president is going to be, which is why I say the only way you take an issue that is somewhat down the priority list and raise it is if it is genuinely bipartisan in nature, which is to complement what's going on here today, and I'm pleased to be part of it, and I think it can happen. One piece of advice I would give to my Democrat friends listening, and I've given this on other topics as well, is one thing that would be really important is let's not throw everything that this administration has done out when we come in. I've given that speech in the context of development assistance in Africa, in the context of democracy promotion around the world, and now I'd say the same thing in terms of poverty reduction. And I don't say only because people are very anti-Bush. This administration came in and decided that nothing that Clinton had done was good. And they threw it all out, and they started all over again. Many of the basis for a bipartisan approach to poverty reduction, as indicated by a lot of the things that Becky and other people talked about this morning, lies in embracing some of the things that have happened, not just in this administration, but over the last couple of administrations. If you want Republican support for an anti-poverty initiative, we've heard the basis of it this morning from many of the people that have spoken. First of all, this administration has put an emphasis on education. No Child Left Behind has become controversial in its later years, but it provides a basis for saying accountability and a focus on K-12 education, something Republicans at the national level never embraced prior to this president. Many Republicans prior to this president were still saying K-12 education is not the proper responsibility of the federal government. Don't just throw that out. Let's say we have to change that, build on it, and embrace the initiatives that many people have talked about in terms of education. That's a basis for bipartisanship. Second, marriage. People have talked about that a good deal. This president has many initiatives. We need, as has been pointed out, a lot of experimentation. That's a potential basis for bipartisanship. Third, the value of work. Republicans take great pride in their role in welfare reform, which was mainly a values-driven issue on their side. The first item that Becky raised was the EITC. I was embarrassed that my party, when they were in control of the Congress, came out with a proposal to scale back the EITC because in its initial initiation, EITC was as much a Republican initiative as it was a Democrat. That, along with other work-enhancing initiatives, including child care subsidies, ought to be able to get Republican support. And finally, the issue of long-term wealth creation, which many people have talked here about. This president talked about it in the context of Social Security, but Al Gore had a similar proposal outside of Social Security in the 2000 campaign. There's no reason we cannot agree on this. Finally, words matter. I'll give you a little advice that I know many people in this room will not like. First of all, to the extent that we frame this debate in terms of opportunity, it's a pure home run winner. Everybody will embrace that. To the extent that we frame it in terms of reducing poverty, with a little bit of explanation, everybody will embrace that too. Republicans need to be convinced it's not just throwing money away on something that isn't going to work, but you can get a bipartisan agreement on that. To the extent that it's framed in terms of reducing inequality, I'm sorry to tell you, we will simply open an endless ideological debate. I'm not saying Republicans are in favor of inequality, but words matter. They have learned over the years that that simply means higher taxes, punishment of business and industry, and to the extent that we want to make forward progress on a bipartisan agenda, it ought to be framed in terms of opportunity and poverty reduction, and not primarily in terms of reducing inequality. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.